everyone, and welcome to another episode of Page Turners Plus. The last time you saw us, when we were interviewing Andy Davis, we mentioned that we'll be reflecting on the lost love songs of Boysie Singh by Ingrid Persaud. Today, we'll be reflecting on this novel. To tell you a bit more about the novel and its author, we have Paula.
Thank you, Raul J. Ingrid Persaud is a Trinidadian writer. Her novel, The Lost Love Songs of Boysie Singh, which was published in April 2024, focuses on four women, each of whom the infamous gangster should have loved, or may even have loved, in the twisted way of sociopaths. Another author may have portrayed them as Boysie's victims, which undoubtedly they were. But what appears to be of greatest concern to Ingrid Persaud is each woman's pursuit of control over her own life. As these characters are four very different women, success looks very different to each of them. For one, gaining Boysie's love would be the pinnacle of happiness. For two, Boysie is a vehicle they believe can transport them to a destination laden with material wealth. For the fourth, bliss would be Boysie Singh dispatched to hell at the speed of light. I would argue that although his name is in the title of the book, Boysie Singh is a mere catalyst in this novel. This is a story about women and power. What drives it is how these women, encumbered by poverty and their gender, navigate their way through the patriarchal colonial Trinidad of the first half of the 20th century.
Thank you, Paula. I think we could pick up right where you left off. So, Ingrid Persaud takes a risky route as she brings to life a flamboyant male historical figure, Trinidadian crime lord Boysie Singh, through four women who knew him intimately. Do you think it succeeded? Did you get a full sense of the character of Boysie Singh? As I read the novel, I found it a little strange and a bit cumbersome as well that the narrative sort of oscillated, between or among these four characters. And I thought perhaps maybe a single narrator would have done better justice to the novel, just because of the different voices and sort of like the bias that you get from each character. But as you read the novel, you sort of get a better understanding of why the four women were used to tell the story. Because in a way, as interesting as Boysie's story is, his story wouldn't be interesting if you didn't get the, how do you put it, get the perspective of the people who sort of saw him at his most desperate and at his most basic level. So I found it interesting that Ingrid Persaud took the route of using these four women to narrate the story, but I saw the reason why she did it. And in a way, these women not necessarily made Boysie who he was, but they sort of helped tell the story of why Boysie was the way he was.
I think there's a bit of history to this as well. The vehicle that Ingrid Persaud used, because what's reported factually on Boysie Singh and his history kind of makes the woman in his life invisible. And I think it's a deliberate attempt by Ingrid Persaud to reverse that, because because they played such a pivotal role in creating who Boysie was, not the gangster Boysie, but keeping him going. And not much historically was said on the woman in Boysie Singh's life. I think that was a deliberate attempt by Ingrid Persaud to address that. So
Are
I'm
we
just saying,
sure?
yeah.
Are we
But
sure that these women were real apart from Doris? We know that Doris was a historical um, figure. We know that he was married to Doris. But are we sure that the other three were real women? I wasn't. I didn't feel sure, and
from the novel,
I
I'm not
wasn't
absolute.
able. I wasn't able to find it. I looked it up, tried looking it up. I wasn't able to find anything.
Yeah, from the novel, it's not clear, but I saw an interview that she did, and I think that's where I am led to believe that, although they're fictional characters in the novel, they
They're
were
based on real people.
they're based
I
on
think
real
that
people.
interesting as well. I think I
Yeah.
read that his execution, the figure of Manalala was the only of the women in the story that are present. And so there is a sense that like this character was real, and that she was the mother of his child, and she'd been there for however
Correct.
long. Um, I thought what she did was majestic. I was very, very enthusiastic about it. Mostly because she did what I've tried to do as a historian in some of my writing, which is tell a history, but from the point of view exclusively of the women who make it. And I thought she did it really, really well, because I do think you get a full sense of who Boysie Singh is. You don't leave it going, I don't know who he is. I know who these women are, but I don't know who he is. I think you leave it going, oh, okay, I know the story of Boysie Singh. I think that's a real challenge, because we never hear Boysie in his own words. We only ever hear him from the point of view of these women who knew him so well. I think she does a good job as well of pulling out some people that knew him earlier and some that knew him later, and having his kind of whole life covered, so to speak. We never see the very, very early beginnings of his life. And I think that speaks to the kind of historical record that she tries to respect. That actually there isn't much about the very early years of Boysie Singh. Um, and when I think also you accomplish something very special, because often with these kind of gangster type narratives, it's a rags to riches stories. It's about the guy and his guys around him. It's about the power that he wields around people, in a way that is probably quite problematic if you think about it. It's about, it kind of feeds this kind of toxic masculinity narratives. And what we see from this story is him at his most vulnerable consistently. When no one else is around, when he's crying for his mother, when he's afraid, when he thinks he's not going to see his son in the house anymore, like all of these kinds of moments, and how they also shape him, right? And we actually see very little of the criminality. We see very little of like how all we get is secondhand when Manalana realizes she can say something by saying, this is Boysie Singh's kid. And she realizes that gives her a bit of power. Then we see that. But we don't actually see Boysie swaggering and just kind of seeing it from a distance, and that being glamorized. That's not the story she tells. And I think that's a real like triumph and a thoughtful way of approaching a figure like this, which has been done differently for so many decades by so many different men.
Do you think it has the potential of shifting the blame, where we get the side of the women and not much of Boysie, particularly for people who aren't aware of the Boysie Singh story? Because for those of us who've done extra reading, we definitely know he was as terrible as they come. But for those who just see a book in a bookstore and pick it up and say, okay, and do you think it demonizes the women, or it has the potential to do so?
No, I don't think so, because they're never responsible for his actions. They enable him at early and at crucial stages. They'll provide the money, they'll provide the headquarters, but often unknowingly they'll do a thing for him, and often he bullies them into it. Right? He tells them to go and do this and tells them to go and do that, and he's very physically violent with all of them. But I think Rosie's the only one he doesn't abuse. Right, and even she gets they get a sense that he's willing to use physical force against them. None of them are willing co-conspirators, right? They're not his equals. He doesn't treat them as such, and they don't understand that the closest. And that's why, one of the characters who kind of thinks of herself as that gets a very rude awakening, but also realizes that. So I don't think you can ever be held guilty. I don't think the author's ever trying to make you feel like it's the women's fault. None of them are Lady Macbeth. They're just women that cross his path and love him sometimes and care about him, and therefore do things for him that enable him to become the notorious gangster Boysie Singh.
It's not really showing us Boise Singh the gangster. It's more showing us Boise Singh the person. Like this gangster, everyone knew everything about him and all the terrible things that he did. But like, who was Boise Singh when he was home with his women and his son? But I don't think it takes away from the fact that he was a very violent sociopath. I mean, even told through the stories of the women. And you see that he was not just a violent person with regards to his criminal enterprise. He was violent with everyone in his life.
So, I mean, it's quite clear that this story is told in a relatively unconventional way. So, what do you think we learned about Boise Singh that we might not have had the story been told in a more traditional rags to riches gangster narrative?
I think there's a lot that we learn if it was like a straight up uh sorry, not autobiography, but biography or psychohistory, something like that. Uh, I think as some of you already pointed out, we learn we learn him in his vulnerable states early on in the text and later on as well. Uh, we we see we see him humanized in multiple ways, which is hard to get at. Um, as speaking as a historian, it's really hard to get at someone's full humanity. I'm not saying that Ingrid Persaud gets him in his full humanity, but the way he is with his son, the his the way he is in terms of thinking about that sword that his father left and said to destroy it. Um, even even his conversion. We don't get a conversion story. It's plopped on us, but nevertheless, it speaks to a person's grappling with his eternity, with his morality. I'm sorry, not mortality. So I think those things that we could grab onto.
Isn't there something about her talking about charisma and power in that conversion story as well? That he's an effective preacher speaks volumes about the kind of the things that make him an effect. Give you a sense of why he was an effective gangster. The way he's able to wield power over a crowd by the force of his words or being. The way that he must have been a real personality to encounter, to be so persuasive, whether or not he's encouraging you to do good or evil, literally. I thought that was a really interesting, mad turn. And you know that, like, you just kind of think that has to be true. It's such a crazy thing to put in a novel. Like, that has to be one of those truth is stranger than fiction moments. You couldn't have made that up. And one of the things I really liked about this novel, actually, is I did a bit of research as well. And some of this, like, kind of, not quite anecdotes in the novel, but some of the happenings in the novel were actually true. But like some of the random ones, right? Like the kind of old lady that they pick up off the street and he kind of becomes mistress of the house. Like that's totally a true story, apparently. And the neighbors that he kind of like threatened, like the tenants were again like just really random things, and you just wonder how much else, someone is able to say that's a true story. My parents told me that story, like that's part of his lore. How much of this novel is anchored in truth, or certainly memory and popular histories of him? I'm so desperate to ask the interviewer, ask the author that question. I'm just so curious. How did you do the research for a novel like this? It really, yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Roger, I also think that what we learn through the woman in Boysie's life, as opposed to it being autobiography of Boysie. Somebody mentioned charisma. Yes, I think clearly that came through his charismatic nature. And what you see there of Boysie's charisma is that he's also a polarizing figure, which charismatic people tend to be, He was also a very polarizing figure. So you had those for him and you had those against him, and I think that was very well demonstrated in the text of the novel. His conversion to the man, the Bible toting man, is very funny to me, because that's not an unusual narrative, Quite a few crooks in this part of the world and globally redeem themselves via that means, and it's an accepted form of redemption, because that is sacrosanct to all believers. I'm not teasing you, Kessel or Eric, but I'm just saying that that manifestation was interesting. Typical crook, especially in the Caribbean, so I found it interesting and amusing.
Oh yeah, definitely. Let me throw in right now because this dude is in the news here in the United States, like Kwame Kilpatrick, former mayor of Detroit, convicted, and former President Trump let him go. And what is he doing now? He's pastoring the church. That almost sounds like Boise. But I want to speak a bit more about colonial Trinidad, because that's pretty much not even 90%, maybe like 60% of what I got from this novel. That this was just colonial happenings in a colonial society. So, do we get a strong sense of Port of Spain in late colonial Trinidad in the Lost Love Songs, or do other novels do that better or already? so that there wasn't much of a demand placed on Prasad in writing this novel. I mean, I've seen similar stories. I could think of Anthony Joseph's Ketch, which is his fictionalized um, biography slash memoir of Lord Kitchener, the famous Calypsonian. Um, a lot of the a lot of the language came up quite strongly here as well. But in terms of a strong sense of colonial Port of Spain, I don't think Ingrid Prasad did the overkill. We got a lot of the racial tensions that came out in the novel as well, the social tensions that existed, but it wasn't overkill. And I suppose also the heavy use of Bhojpuri was quite telling because over time the use of that in regular language in Trinidad has diminished. So I suppose by the infusion of all these Bhojpuri words throughout the novel is meant to give a meant to time the novel to show us that this was a time when people still connected to their ancestry much closer than they do now. So I do get the sense that she did that, but I don't think there was overkill. I've definitely seen stronger colonial connections, if you want to call it that, in other novels. Anthony Joseph, that one definitely comes straight to mind. But I
Not
don't
to
think
mention
any
Naipaul.
others. Well, I've actually never read Naipaul.
Did you not read? Okay, you just said no, so let me not ask that question. Oh, well, I think I read Miguel Street and the Mystic Masseur, and they really evoke that time. I actually think her timing is interesting because she covers this period of like what you realize is the early 1930s, right up to the end of his life in like the late 1950s. But the time, I don't feel the time jump is seamless. It in the sense that I don't feel like okay now we're in the 1940s, okay now we're in the 1950s, now we're in the 1960s, and I'm not sure that was required, but I certainly felt a little bit lost in terms of what's actually happening now, like what year is this, like what like they would suddenly announce it's 1940 and like but oh so we like she just
Is
skips
that
over
did
quite
you
a
did you
lot.
get lost in the transition of the baby, the bacha, the beta? Because one minute um he was a baby and in the other minute he was fully aware, fully conscious, saying
I
things
feel
that
like time was something that I'm not sure that was plotted
Hmm.
well. It didn't feel like time flowed. It didn't feel like time flowed naturally. And you get that there's different women and they're telling the story, but sometimes it was really neat, and you could kind of tell that this is a few weeks after or around the same time as, and it's a different perspective. And sometimes I think years have now passed. Um, and we're now like in a different decade, like in and it's a really important time period, right? This time period is the period, the early 1930s. This is the end of World War One. It's the Garvey movement that's just happened. In the 1930s in Trinidad, you're going to have this massive moment in 1937, which is totally absent, right? Like we're not going to see Elma Francois. She's not going to pop up. We're not going to see the hunger marches through Port of Spain. None of that. We know that there's poverty, and I think that's kind of interesting because these are poor people, but they're totally unaffected by some of the nation's biggest historical moments. Which is a choice, right? Maybe they're
well
just not clued in.
someone that we know said in their review that they didn't get much political or social context from the novel.
Yeah, well, then the
Um,
Americans come and he benefits from that, and we've heard that
mhm.
about Trinidad. Like it brought a lot of money to Trinidad, and it was a different sort of experience from other parts of the Caribbean. But then they leave again, and that doesn't seem to create any problems. Yeah, like the fact that the people that have propped him up, and then independence is on the way. There was a point where they were talking about the trial, and I was like, isn't Eric Williams giving talks on this same Woodford Square like around this time? And we never hear of him either. Like there's so many things that are. I don't think it has to be. They had to be in the novel, but it's a conscious choice to leave them out. I think right. That has to be what's going on. And I'm curious about that. I don't think I enjoy the novel. I don't think it's a weakness, but that I couldn't follow the time because there aren't useful markers of other than they get married in this particular year, which has no kind of historical relevance. I found that jarring and hard to follow sometimes.
Yeah, I actually think it is a weakness. Um, and again, I'm speaking straight as a historian. Um, I think the readers need context, not overkill as you just mentioned, Raw J, but some touchstones helps, and it helps us understand the people. Context is everything. So yeah, I got lost, and I left at times scratching my head about the years that went by, like in a vapor. I mean, I struggled to understand where were the characters situated in time. So I do think it's a weakness.
But I
Well,
wonder though, because considering this is written from the perspective, these are four first person narrations of characters. Would they necessarily have been particularly interested in all of these, I mean, I think she definitely dropped nuggets in there to help you know like what time it was, talking about the American soldiers or whatever. But when you consider that this was not done by an how do you say it, a third person narrator telling the story and giving background, these are all first person narratives of very poor women who are just struggling to try to make it through every day. Like, would they really be that concerned with all of these things that you're mentioning, Keswa, that were going on?
It's a
I don't
big
know.
question. I think a character like Rosie and a character like Doris are the types of characters who are very observant of their surroundings because they're keen to aid, I think on Rosie's part, not get caught out, and on Doris's part, like maximize every opportunity that comes. So I think shifting power structures that are going to be happening as the West Indies Federation is on the horizon, right? As independence is looming, right? I think those two particularly, I would expect to see something more insightful because they're observant characters. They're very careful. You might have seen it from Popo as well, but she exits the story, I think, at an earlier point. Manalala, I wouldn't necessarily need her to kind of be like watching the news and following because that isn't the world that she occupies. She's not interested in the world beyond her front door. But the others are, and that's why it's unusual, I think. That's what, and also, poor people's lives are going to change the most, right?
Yeah, I
Like,
know. I didn't get the
of those with
impression.
promises, they're the people that are being promised the most, should we say,
I
in lots
didn't
of
really get
ways.
the impression that Doris was interested in anything but upward mobility for herself, to be honest.
But that's why she's watching to see which way to go, right?
Yeah.
If times are uncertain, she's going to be paying attention to like where to put her eggs. So that's why you think she would remark on like actually the white people on that side are not as cool as the white people on this side anymore, and that's why you think she would be paying
Yeah,
attention.
and remember, she what was the work that she did? I mean, she had to have access to certain conversations, and she was trying to better herself, trying not to talk, Trini English. Um, so I think she was very cognizant of representation, which I would also equate to someone being knowledgeable about the times. So yeah, I again, I think it's a weakness. I'm not dogmatic on this because I think it was a literary choice, and I'm willing to give the author some grace on this, but that's why we have follow-up conversations. I think I'm a bit more forgiving with this one. I know the lack of context that you speak about, but I really think you Kessel and Eric, you may be looking for more of what was going on politically at the time. There were some significant milestones. Yes, I accept all of that, but I think a lot of because the novel is Boysie Singh as a central character. A lot of it is about the underworld of the society at that time. And yes, a lot of what was said there in that period that she's capturing is well, I don't want to use the word accurate, but it's yeah, it's true. There was that same game that you hear about Weiwei, that has some
Wait, wait.
really grounded roots and still exist in Trinidad today. And it's been officialized by the National Lottery. They've taken it over, right? Um, but that was an underworld game, which was very significant in the novel. The club scene, the prostitution scene, all of those things. Um, if you had some sort of historical knowledge of Trinidad, so I guess the authors making the assumption that the reader perhaps knows a bit about what was
Mhm.
going on in that time. But the timestamp was fine to me. I didn't get lost. I was always in that period. I didn't need the Federation story. I didn't need the other things to keep me locked into the period that Ingrid Persaud was
Even with the
capturing.
son, because I feel like the son, I completely agree, went from like being a baby to being 4 to being 12 to being old enough to like take over his father's affairs. Like
You
it
know,
went very quickly.
guess what?
Yeah, but I mean, if
Go ahead,
you
Francine.
wouldn't want that to be dragged out either, right?
Especially,
So
it would have
she
been
had to,
700 pages instead of
she
500.
was
Yeah.
going, exactly, she was going to at different, I guess, critical points in Boise Singh's life. And then you
Mm.
learn that, well, at this point, the son is X amount of years. So,
You know,
you
the
know,
assumptions I'm talking about, right, is if you and I keep forgetting, guess I'm probably 2 decades older than you, but if you're from this part of the world, St. Vincent, Boise Singh actually is a household name, was a household name in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, because there are people who came from Trinidad, established themselves here, and it was rumored that they were part of Boise Singh's gang, right? There at least 4 people that who were operating here as big businessmen. And it was and they came from Trinidad. It was rumored that they were part of Boise Singh's gang. So this guy was a known person, not just in Trinidad, right? But if you listen to the calypsos in those times as well, you would see, and the calypsos were a lot about social commentary. You will see that themes runs through the theme of what the Calypsonians sang about. A lot of it, the gangster side of Trinidad and the club scene and all that ran through Ingrid's novel. So they're still aligned in that early 1950s period, right? So I had no difficulty with it.
All right. I think this is a good time for us to take in a read-in from the author, so that we could hear from her and to listen to a bit of the narration that we were talking about earlier so that our viewers could understand what we're speaking to. We'll be right back.
Hi, my name's Ingrid Persaud, and I'm the author of The Lost Love Songs of Boysie Singh. And I'm going to read to you from the beginning of the novel. And it starts with a fictional newspaper report. The Trinidad Monitor, Port of Spain, Trinidad, British West Indies, Friday, 23rd August, 1957. The End of Boysie Singh by Jared Max Davidson, staff reporter. Knowing the end was coming, John Boysie Singh, the Raja, who once controlled illegal activities in Port of Spain and in the Gulf of Paria, said, "I have lived, I have seen things, and I have done things. Now I must go, but I am innocent of this crime. I always try to help people, and that is how I got a great deal of my troubles. That is what has me here now." He asked to go first, but on 20th August 1957 was made to wait an hour until 8 o'clock after Bolan Ramkissoon's body was cut down and laid aside. A Catholic priest, Father Tiernan, who asked for his name not to be reported, walked him to the gallows. Wearing prison issue white cotton pajamas, the Raja met death chanting, "My Jesus mercy, my Jesus mercy, my Jesus mercy." As prescribed, the hangman was paid $77 per man for his duties. A Gregorio Brothers van took the body from the jail to the General Hospital and then to the St. James Cemetery, where Boysie was laid to rest in a crude white pine unpainted coffin, his name written on top in chalk. None of his close relatives, seen visiting the condemned man in the days leading up to the hanging, were present at the graveside.
And welcome back. So before we took the reading, we were focusing a lot on the narration, the women characters, and even Boysie Singh. So the question that I want to ask now is: did your opinion of any of the characters change as the novel progressed? And also, did you have any favorites? Let me add that in.
I had a favorite, Popo. I was rooting for Popo. Um, my opinion of Manalala changed because I started off thinking of Manalala as an abject idiot without any hope. Towards the end of the novel, I liked her a little bit more.
Yeah, Popo was also my favorite. I thought she was the only one who actually had a lick of sense between all of between the four women, and and like Paula, towards the end, I Manalala managed to kind of redeem herself in terms of some of the actions that she took. She realized that she was doing utter crap, and so she changed in that way. Um, Doris amused me. I got lots of laughs from Doris, and Rosie actually was pretty serious. She was probably the most serious of the four women, and I found her very interesting, especially her mythological aspect. Let's put it that way, not to give away any too much spoilers. Yeah, I thought that she had a good head on her shoulders, and she knew what she was about.
You see, I didn't dismiss Doris as stupid at all. I thought Doris had good sense.
No, I didn't think she was stupid. She amused me. I found her whole approach to life. I found her more amusing than anything else. I didn't think she was stupid. She knew what she wanted and she was going after it. So, yeah.
I found Doris exceedingly interesting. This red woman who owns her redness and sees what it could do for her and maximize it. I'm just like, wow, this is different. I like it. You're not trying to defend. Um, she's not a sympathetic character in that way. She's just a woman that using every ounce of the power that she has to get the things she wants, and it's kind of you kind of have a sort of a begrudging respect for her, perhaps, for just like being unapologetically herself. And I think that's kind of
Tessa, well,
interesting.
I think it's because you weren't raised in the Caribbean why a red woman owning her redness surprises you. That is
I
a
think
thing.
no,
That is a
I
thing.
think I'm probably more familiar.
Everybody in the Caribbean knows the power of redness. And I think more red people own their redness than don't.
Interesting.
Paul is absolutely correct. It's a thing. There's no two ways about it. And the red woman in the Caribbean, in St. Vincent, to be specific, are very proud of their redness, and they wave it about. There's no two ways about it. And
This is the circles I move in. People are much more
they
determined to
wave
prove
it
they're not like
about.
a typical red woman.
Yeah.
Because you're an academic and you probably hang around with academics. But
Altogether possible.
in the rest of the world, in the non-academic world,
I'm not
everybody
disputing
knows
that.
the
I'm just
power of
saying I
Yeah,
redness.
so if you listen to Caribbean music, even that should show you when they sing about red women and the power that they give red women in the songs. I mean, that calypso or dance or whatever, that's revealing, you know.
Yeah,
I,
yeah. Castaway. Maybe you should listen to some African American blues too. Uh, or
I don't know why I'm actually cheating
come
my
home
musical
to
taste
South
right now.
Louisiana, where the red woman still rules.
What about the other women? I think I probably had more sympathy for Manalala in the early part of the novel. Um, it felt like she was just simple, just really simple, excessively and extremely simple, but ultimately simple. And being simple is not a crime.
Bordering and being stupid, to be honest.
I think
There's a thin line there on how simpleton you can be, right, without being given the label of stupid. But
I think she walks it though. I think she walks it. I think she is the maximum simple you can be. Um, is probably what I would say, because I think
But she's not all that much of a simpleton, because she's not brilliant. She's no genius, but
Mm.
she's manipulative.
yeah.
She's
But
not
I
as
agree with you,
stupid.
Paula. She redeems
She's
herself in
not
the
as
end, eh?
she's not as stupid as we think.
I don't
Look
think
at
she's
how
stupid.
look
When
at
I say
look.
simple, I mean in the sense, in the kind of purest sense of the word, right? She literally just wants Boysie to marry her because they've had a child together. Like it's like she's just that he's a big time gangster, that he has power, that he might have money. She never asked anything from him. She genuinely loves him as well, right? And that's kind of interesting for her. It's motivated by the fact that look what we could be if we were. That I love you. We have a child together. All my friends are married. Like it's the simplest of things, right?
Yeah.
That's what I mean. Her
And
desires
we have
are
to take into
extremely simple.
consideration the period that we're talking about. I mean, you're not going to find a woman like that today necessarily, but we're talking,
Good. I
you
don't.
know,
I
well,
think you can find
yes,
women like
yes,
that today.
obviously, but less and less so. Um, but in that period, and I think a lot of us forget as well the abject poverty that the Indian race in Trinidad had to grapple with. Um, and
It's interesting that she doesn't demand money from Boise in that context, though, right?
But that's because she loved him so much. She's not going to do anything that she has to confront him about. But what I find interesting about the novel is that even a character like Manalala, who I think is an abject idiot, is trying to exert her own power.
Mm.
All four women, we see them grasping, to take control over their own lives and to empower themselves because she is doing it for reasons that we might not think are good reasons. Basically, she wants Boise to herself, but she makes power plays and she makes successful power plays too, all four women. And that is what I found most interesting about the novel. Watching these women who are in who've been marginalized try
Mm.
to grasp power. That I found fascinating.
Yeah, she's very calculating. It throughout the whole text, she's very calculating. She's shrewd, and even she goes against maybe her own like native convictions about certain things by employing certain devices to get what she wants. So yeah, I definitely sympathize with Manalala. I mean, she was not my favorite character. I think I agree with y'all about Popo. Popo was she was so down to earth, but she also had those aspirations.
She's also
Uh,
kind. She's the only one of the three that is explicitly, outwardly
mm,
kind to people that she doesn't mean to be kind to. She's the
right.
only one that displays kindness, I think.
No,
Yeah.
Rosie,
Interestingly, I was
Rosie,
interestingly,
Rosie's
who are you saying
caring.
is kind?
Popo.
Popo.
No, but I thought Rosie was a very kind woman.
But I
I
mean,
think,
even Manalala with her aunt, she was extremely lovely to the poor aunt, right?
but I think
So
Manala's
yeah, I
kind of his
think the only
only
one who
excuse to be.
wasn't kind was probably Doris. Doris didn't help
No,
anybody.
but Doris looked out for her family.
Right.
So
Yeah.
She
I
did.
think we
She
saw
did look
kindness
out
in,
for her family. She did look out for her right.
she loved the
She
son.
loved the son. What's his
So
name
I
again?
Harry.
whatever his name was, but
Chokesy.
The
Chunksy.
Chungsi. But
Chunksy.
all the
Chokesy.
women that I found interesting that
The
Ingrid Prasad chose to portray all the women as loving the son, not holding his father against him.
Against right.
So yeah,
Yeah.
that was
Yeah.
interesting.
Even though originally they both Popo and Doris were like, wait, this man really expect me to mind some other woman child, but they still ended up. I mean, even towards the end, Doris and Chunksy had a really good relationship.
Mhm.
So yeah.
I think Doris was the shrewdest of the four. Personally,
More so
well,
than Popo.
more so than I don't want to spoil, but I mean, Popo was
Popo
not the
was
extent of the 500 pages,
You're
right?
thinking because of how Popo ended.
Yeah.
I don't
Well,
hold that against
I
her.
thought I thought
I don't
Boise
hold.
loved Popo the most
yeah, probably did.
until her ending, until the ending of
Yeah,
But
probably
that
did. But Doris was shrewd. If
story
you
was
know where
amazing.
Toko is, Toko in Trinidad. If you know where that
There's a
is,
whole song about it. Let me
it's behind
thinking of
God's back,
you.
right? And it still is in the minds of
Of
Port of
most
Spain
Trinidadians.
Trinidadians, right?
Right.
So for somebody to come from there, flaunt her redness, get the biggest gangster in town, get all the material things, get all
That's the
these
thing. Yes.
parties going, and all. Well, that's a shrewd woman. Um,
Mm.
you know, and yeah, she looked out for her family too, so she made sure she
That
carried
her
them
family
along.
married well as well.
She made sure she carried. I liked her. You know. I liked Doris.
But wouldn't that like her relationship with Boise? I just put that down to Boise playing his cards right. In terms of utilizing her as a sort of status symbol, as a way to say, well, look, I have a red woman. Especially in those days, for somebody like Boise, who's trying to be the gangster of the town,
Not
he
just,
would want to take to Port of Spain his red woman. That's all
and
I saw it
and not
as.
just any
Oh,
red woman.
absolutely.
I think he saw her coming as well, right? He clocked her as someone who was also on the up and up,
Right.
and he recognized her as a partner who could take him to places because
Right.
when they
Because
met, she was still a maid,
yeah,
but she
and
wasn't every
he
kind of
knew
maid.
that he could never present Popo or Manalala as his wife in high society, right? He knew that just couldn't happen. But Doris was climbing, and she was a red woman. So yeah.
But I also found it interesting that Boise was, from what I gather in the novel anyway, that Boise was seemed more like a black man than an Indian man to me.
That
You
I
Yeah,
found
know,
thank you.
interesting. That
Thank
I
that
found
you.
that, yeah.
that I found
Yes.
interesting.
And
That
he
the
talks
fact
about it.
that yes, because it's a big deal in the novel actually. The fact that he rejects Indian culture, he rejects his own religion. He wants to embrace. It's really interesting. It's fascinating because this is during the colonial period when the colonial authorities denigrate all things not European. So they denigrate Indian culture, but they also denigrate African culture. So I found it interesting that he wants to get ahead, but he embraces African culture. And I wonder if it is because he grew of where he grew up, because he did grow up in Port of Spain, which was a very African community. So I suspect it's probably a lot like that. I mean, but even to the point of the person he emulates when he wants to look snazzy is Cab Calloway. You
Yep,
know, he chooses
yep.
a black icon.
Hmm.
So that I found fascinating, and it is a big deal in the novel because you hear Manalala is extremely upset about the fact that he rejects his own culture in favor of African culture. For
Correct.
example, he won't go to a pundit, but he embraces
Mother
Mother
Gizzard.
Gizzard.
Right,
Yeah.
Dinazad, yeah.
right.
But
The
I don't think Malala is
spiritual
upset that he
aspect.
doesn't embrace his culture more generally. But I think it's particular moments where she wants to maintain traditions and he doesn't. I think the rest of the time she doesn't. She's not that bothered, and I think she kind of understands, I guess, the dynamics of town. She doesn't expect more. It's a very key moment where she's going to fight with her mother about it. That she wants him to do things the Indian way, and I think that's worth pointing out as well. I think Persaud is trying to tell us that actually these divisions between Indian and African are perhaps not as old or as deeply rooted as we often think of in
Right,
Trinidad. I don't know, but that's what I
right.
assume because it is like you say, it's notable, it's commented upon, and it's a point in the novel that she's making.
Yeah, I
But
think that's an excellent point.
the geography, as Paula said, is also significant. If you know the structure of Port of Spain, Laventille, Morvant, and those sort of areas down west, which a lot of the novel is centered around. Well, that's black culture dominated. There's no two ways about it. Central Trinidad is Indian, but that's black culture dominated. So Boise may have had to identify naturally or just sort of was expedient about it.
Yeah,
It's
it may
interesting,
be.
particularly because his dad is from India, right? He's not someone who's arrived a long time ago as well. There's no it's a choice to reject his roots, so to speak. Sorry, Eric.
And no, and I think that when as I thought about that particular point, uh, it I thought that Prasad was getting into this transitional period in terms of culture that there is emerging a Trinidadian culture, not particular a bifurcating one. I think the bifurcation is starting to break down. Boise Singh, in some ways, represents that. Doris, in a way, represents that as well. Proximity, obviously, helps to inculcate that. I remember a saying that I heard in Trinidad: uh, African man, Indian woman might be separate in day, but they're together at night.
Well, there's a calypso about that, Eric. But that would take us on a tangent. But yeah, the calypso actually deals with how strongly an Indian woman loves a black man. It's a thing in Trinidad, right?
So we're almost out of time, but I think a very good question to end with would be, some of us had concerns about how language was presented in the novel. Does anyone wish to address that?
I do. I found she didn't write Trinidadian, the language, the way that we know it's spoken. It seemed to me that she was trying to make it easier for non-Caribbean people to understand. I found it distracting, and quite frankly, I found it disrespectful of the language. Um, I don't know that it quite frankly, it surprised me that we are still doing this at this time, because we've had so many conversations as Caribbean people about language and about owning our language and about not apologizing for our language. So it surprised me. And what is interesting is that I read reviews from non-Caribbean people who are still complaining that the language was too hard to understand. Don't do it. Just don't do it. Writers, don't do it. Do not pander to what you think the audience wants. Write true to the language. Be respectful of the language. Write it the way it's spoken. I she did write. It did have the general cadence of Trinidadian, but verbs and nouns were doing things that they do not do in our language. They do that in in the English that is spoken in metropolitan centers,
Mm-hmm.
and it really distracted me, and I had to pull myself back to enjoy the book because it was so distracting and quite frankly disappointing.
I will say I listened to it rather than read it, and so I didn't pick that up in the same way because it's narrated by Persaud and a couple of other people, with what feels like very regular Trinidadian speakers. So I wonder if that's a difference. If it was
No,
narrated.
I listened to it as well. I read it first.
Really?
Yes, I read it first and then I listened to it. And when I listened to it, it was still great. It still grated on me because,
Okay.
like I said, nouns and verbs were doing things that they do in metropolitan English. They do not do that in the forms of English that we speak in the Caribbean.
And one of the things that I also thought about that, because I agreed with you, Paul, I found it very distracting, especially in the same sentence. It would start off as Trini, and then I would have nouns and verbs agreeing. And then when I reflected on Doris's story and the fact that in Doris's story, we see her making the effort to speak properly, it kind of negates the whole fact, the whole thing with why do that with for the other people when you can easily show in Doris's story what standard English is compared to Trinidadian English. That was my thought about that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point there, Francine. And I do agree with Paul. It was quite distracting. But we'll have a second bite at the cherry because the next time you see us, we'll be interviewing Ingrid Persaud about her latest novel, The Lost Love Songs of Boysie Singh. Until then, goodbye. Thank you for joining us.